Welcome to the OhioRAAM Show, number 276.
Well, hello again. It's Lee Kreider here with the OhioRAAM Show, a show that puts the ultra in ultra cycling. And if you want to know what ultra cycling is, we've got the guy here today to talk to us about that, Marc, who's the newly elected president of the World Ultra Cycling Association. But first, we want to point out that right down below here are show notes. You can find information there about the World Ultra Cycling Association and some other things as well. Also, we want to remind you that this show comes to you as a result of the good people who operate the Race Across America time stations here in Ohio. Time stations 41 in Oxford, 42 in Blanchester, and 43 in Chillicothe. So with that, we want to go to Marc down in North Carolina. Where is it you're at in North Carolina, Marc?
Well, if you're familiar with the mountains of West North Carolina, Mount Mitchell, which is the highest point east of the Rockies, is right out my back window.
Okay, very well. So, welcome to the OhioRAAM Show. I believe you were on here once before, weren't you?
I was in probably a very different state of mind, but I was at a time station somewhere in Ohio, as I recall, in 2016. And we stopped in to say hello as you were transmitting live from RAM at that year.
Okay, very well. Well, as I said, we welcome you here because you're just the newly elected president of the World Ultra Cycling Association. I didn't vote for you, Marc, and the reason I didn't is because I was chagrined to find out I'd let my membership lapse, but I'm now reinstated, and we're happy to welcome you into that role. For those who do not know, what is the World Ultra Cycling Association and what does it do?
Okay, good question. Good place to start. The World Ultra Cycling Association is a nonprofit which has the purpose of promoting, sanctioning, and certifying long-distance events or ultra cycling events around the world, which of course begs the question, what is ultra cycling? And I'll come back to that in a moment. But the key really is the promotion and sanctioning of this range or family of events like RAM, like many, many others around the world, some of which are well known, some of which are not so well known. But it's a sport that, while founded in cycling, is really quite different than what I'll call mainstream cycling, or the forms of bike racing that you'll see certified by and sanctioned by UCI, or here in America, USA Cycling. Typically very, very long distances, long duration events, without stops, without stage breaks, etc. And typically without drafting, so none of the dynamics of the pack and sprinting as you would see in mainstream racing. So we can talk more about what are ultra cycling events, how do we define ultra cycling, but back to what is World Ultra Cycling Association. It's one that intends to promote and sanction the sport in its various forms.
And you maintain a lot of records, do you not, from events? You want to say a little about that? I think that's kind of interesting.
It is. In fact, it's emerging to be, I'll say, one of two main initiatives, main thrusts of what, and forgive me if I use the acronym WUCA, but WUCA is just shorthand for World Ultra Cycling Association. One of the two main thrusts of WUCA's activities is maintaining that database of records. So records come in a variety of forms. One example would be the most miles or kilometers, the most distance covered in a 24-hour individual, whether it be track or road course. In fact, one of the stars of the sport, Christoph Strasser, has kind of stuck his flag on the ground and said, my goal for this year, and interestingly, it might be an event that actually survives all of the cancellations, which is because it's a solo event, and he's going after the 24-hour record. I have no doubt that if anybody on the planet can do it, it will be him. So that would be a record, an example of a record that we would maintain that says most miles or kilometers covered in 24 hours. And that's one sort of record, but we also do point to points, whether that be from, say, Oceanside, California to Annapolis, Maryland, or in the case of states, one that is familiar to me because it's here in North Carolina is Murphy to Manteo. It's about 565 miles across the state of North Carolina. So on our website are all the 50 states, many countries around the world, and there are typically established geographic points that are the furthest west and the furthest east. The time connecting those two dots is then the record east-west, west-east, north-south, etc.
And then you also have various categories like mixed events and so forth for those records. One of the ones that I think is relatively new, if I'm right, is the capital to capital records.
Yes.
And I've said, result of that, there isn't any reason that anybody that wants to can't have a record.
Well, I hope it gets harder and harder over time, but only because people are setting the bar higher and higher. But you're absolutely correct. The capital is a category that was introduced not too long ago. Of course, there's also age groups, genders, bike types, solo versus relay, two-person relay, four-person, etc. So yeah, there's a million records out there to be had, and the bar has been set at various degrees of difficulty for the different ones, and the easy way to kind of compare those is average speed over time, of course, but it's an interesting avenue, I'll say, for competition for two reasons. One is the cost. Right? If you live, for example, in Ohio and you want to do the capital of Ohio to the capital of West Virginia, just to pick a random nearby state, you can do that without forming a crew, transporting that entire crew to a relatively distant location, for example, Oceanside. Knock out that record ride in the day or so that it takes, and then go back home. So logistic costs and complexities are much, much lower than entering an event that somebody else has timed and dictated the terms for. Number one. The other thing, though, that's interesting, and I'm optimistic that we're going to see a spike this year in that sort of activity, is that you may not be subject to the same kinds of constraints or even prudent limitations of social interaction. So if you have, for example, your family as your crew and perhaps two or three others, an official, witness, etc., and you need to move those people from point A to point B, whether that's a capital to capital or a northwest limit of a state, whatever, you can do that without gathering for a pre-race meeting with 100 people, because that's going to be canceled, right? So in this current environment where all these organized events are being canceled, and you've trained for something, if you're a racer who has trained for an event, I'll say, for example, in the middle of June, and all of a sudden that event's not going to happen. Well, here's a way to use your fitness, reasonable cost, reasonable logistic complexity, and do something that both recognizes and tests your fitness, but also fits in with your training schedule and your planned season.
Yes. Now, for example, for those of you around this part of the country, here in Ohio, the north-south record is between the Toledo Zoo and the Cincinnati Zoo, which I thought was kind of unusual points. There's a lot longer north-south possibility here in Ohio, but that is where it is set. And I would like to also do a shout out to my friend, and I'm sure your friend as well, who holds more records than anybody else, I believe, Gary Edelman.
Yes.
And over in Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
Yeah.
He just keeps rolling them up, doesn't he?
It's amazing, and he's a great example of an ultra cyclist in all of its meaning. So he's a member of our board of directors. He holds personally over 100 records. He's in his mid-70s. So it's a testament to not only the belief which I hold dear, which is that fitness begets fitness. So as you age and remain active, you actually age more, I'll say, gracefully or with better health. He's a perfect example of that. And he's managed to integrate those activities, those records, into a pretty adventurous lifestyle, I'll say. If you look at our website and the history of records, his are not just records around his home state. They're international. He goes to
all
Europe,
over the world. Yeah.
Italy, et cetera. And if there's a record in the either 60 to 70 or 70 to 80 age range, it's probably his.
Yeah, he's a great guy, and we enjoy him. There's also, now, I think the World Ultra Cycling Association pretty much confines its agenda to on the pavement and supported. Is that correct?
Yes, on the pavement for sure. And it's interesting because we find offshoots, I'll say, from mainstream cycling in various directions. One of the obvious currently popular ones is gravel racing. And there's no question there are gravel races that stretch into the ultra cycling realm. The famous one, obviously, Dirty Kanza 200. Nobody would question, but that is an ultra cycling type of event. So you have gravel, you have endurance mountain bike racing, lots of 24-hour mountain bike races out there. But you're correct. Our focus has been, and probably for the near future at least, will remain on pavement. And then the other question is supported versus unsupported. And that's one where I'll say that the focus has not really been intentional or by definition so much as just by custom. And one of the things I see in the future of WUCA as it expands and grows and wants to be more inclusive of different elements of the sport is to be more accommodating of that unsupported. We do nothing currently to exclude unsupported events. But for example, in records, clearly somebody who's riding unsupported is going to have a tough time competing for a record with somebody who has ridden that supported. So we really need to do some things to recognize that differentiation and the fact that an unsupported 1,000-mile, as an example, ride is going to be a slower pace, not because the person is a lesser athlete, but because just the whole nature of that event is different than a supported one.
And your authentication is going to be somewhat different. That's it's a little less certain, even though they may have GPS and all that.
Right. It's almost now that you mention it, almost an oxymoron to say a witnessed unsupported event, because
right. Not that anybody would ever cheat, but it may have been known.
But the whole nature of unsupported racing is that you're out there by yourself, but yet for a record, you need to have a witness car. You need to have a follow car with a witness, a judge in it. So you're almost supported by definition. But that notwithstanding, records notwithstanding, certainly there are unsupported events like the Trans Am, Transcontinental, et cetera, that I consider to be very much relevant and within our sphere of ultra cycling.
Right.
I'll make the generalization that one thing that's common amongst almost all ultra cyclists is just a visceral love of cycling, love of being on one's bike.
Passion.
And so the one saving grace, I guess, is that going out and riding long and by oneself is still possible. We're not stuck with the cabin fever. That said, organized events are really struggling to maintain confidence that they'll be able to hold those events. Certainly the ones within the next few weeks have pretty much all been canceled. As far as I know, they have all been canceled.
Pretty much.
Yeah, and the real dilemma, the question facing everybody is how far out in time do the organizers need to make that call, that judgment of go, no go. And obviously the two events on my mind, maybe not obviously, but the two events on my mind that are centerpieces of the year are RAM for the U.S. and even more so, I guess, for Europeans who have to travel so
They
far
have,
with the
yeah.
crew. The logistic investment in a RAM showing for a European or an Asian is just almost mind-boggling. It's huge. And then beyond that is the Olympics. I'm nervous about whether we're going to have an Olympics this year, which isn't so much ultra cycling, but that's the pinnacle of almost all sport, whether it's cycling or track and field or soccer or whatever.
Well, it certainly is, but under the optimistic view that we will survive all this and there will be another year.
Oh, yeah.
I know you have some future ideas for the World Ultra Cycling Association, and coming in as president, you wanted to implement some of those. Would you share what you have in mind? I've seen one bouncing around the social media already.
Mm-hmm. Sure, happily. So I said earlier that the purpose of WOCA is beyond sanctioning of activities of those who are already in the sport, the promotion of the sport. So we're a very, compared to mainstream cycling, ultra cycling is a tiny little niche event or family of events. And so one of the roles of WOCA, one of the things that we can do to contribute is to encourage folks to come across from either the mainstream realm, or some even come in and turn out to be quite competitive from long distance recreational cyclists. So promoting activities, promoting participation within the sport is that value that we can add. Two things that you may have seen or heard about already are support for female racers and encouragement for youth. Ultra cycling tends to be dominated by, unfortunately, older, I'll say midlife and beyond male cyclists. So expanding that footprint, that demographic, means encouraging women to come into the sport. There's certainly no shortage of strong, competitive women cyclists. And in fact, there's some data that would suggest that women, as they age, actually lose their endurance less than men do. One of my thrills this year will be watching RAAM, in fact, because with Mr. Strasser not participating, this could be a year where we see a woman for the first time ever.
I think that is highly likely, and that would be one of the great disappointments of having to cancel.
Oh,
and we're not going to name names,
right,
but we know who we're talking about, don't we?
We do. So anyway, back to what WOCA can do. We've started a female scholarship program where any female member of WOCA who's kind of interested to tip their toe in the water, as we would say, of ultra cycling, can apply, and with the right kind of almost, I hate to compare it to a college application, but we've asked a few questions. We want ideally to encourage people who will give back to the sport through encouraging their friends, additional female cyclists or younger cyclists, whatever the case may be. But those who are selected will receive a $100 stipend towards a registration fee and or expenses for a chosen event. So that's on the female side. And then on the youth side, we've basically eliminated the membership fee for anyone under approximately 25 years old. So if you're born, I think it was in 2005, no, that's 15 years old, 1995 or beyond, you're eligible for a drastically reduced membership. It's $10 membership fee for those that pass that age test. So we're eager to pull in youth members, and we do have a few. In fact, one from the Midwest. I was hesitating because he's not from Ohio, but a nearby state there in the Midwest, and there's some youngsters entering the sport that are going to be real powerhouses. And interestingly, they did not come through mainstream cycling.
Let's be frank, the World Ultra Cycling Association, or whatever the predecessor name was, which I've since erased from my mind, has struggled a bit with membership and agenda and what have you, has it not? And your goal is to try to bring that around.
Yeah, that's a fair statement. I'm not in any sense embarrassed by that. We have a long history and one that's had its peaks and valleys. But with that history comes, I'll say, lessons for what works and what doesn't work, what can cripple an organization and where an organization can jump forward. And it has a global reach that's been developed over those decades. So I think the new board, and it's not entirely new, but we've welcomed some new members to the board this year that broaden that geographic outlook, broaden the, I'll call it the event outlook. You raised the question about supported versus unsupported. We have some people who are strong vocal advocates for the unsupported inclusion in that. So it's that board and the future view to a shared desire to grow the organization that has led to those initiatives, such as the youth membership, the female scholarship, and others still to come. Mm-hmm.
And before we go, I want to give a shout out to my friend who has retaken the assignment of doing the website for the World Ultra Cycling Association. My buddy Shu Pillinger over there in England. Yes. You just won't let go of her, will you?
No, she's a tremendous asset to us, and she's perhaps the most active and visible, certainly the most helpful to me of our volunteers. But let me use that, if I may, as a springboard for just a 15-second plug for the organization and membership. One of the questions that we continuously ask ourselves on the board and as an organization is, why do people join? And by implication, why do people not join?
Yeah.
There's an annual membership fee, but it's not a big obstacle. Rather than thinking of what do I as an ultracyclist get for my $35, I'd like people to think a little bit about that as how is my $35 going to be used if I choose to join to do what the organization attempts to do, which is promote, sanction, and support. And so when you see things like the female scholarships or the youth free memberships, those sorts of things, those are things that take resources to pull people into the sport and to grow the sport. And it may very well be that you're not getting a $35 coupon or discount on this bike or that pair of sunglasses, but you're promoting and helping to support and grow the sport.
Ask not what WOCA could do for me, but what can I do for WOCA? Is that right?
I guess so, yes, to a degree, yeah.
To paraphrase a famous speech, there might be a blessing here that some people would say, hey, my race has been canceled, but I can go out and nail one of these records with just a couple people, not violate the gathering rules, and there's rules and regulations there on the website, which I ought to mention again on the show notes right below here. You'll see a link to the World Ultra Cycling Association where you can join, find out more about it. And I would highly urge you to do so. Thank you very much, Mark, for being with us.
My pleasure. I would do the same. I think record attempts are a great substitute, last minute, if you will. There is some time lead time requirement, but it's not huge. If you're interested in doing one of those and have questions about it, feel free to write to me personally. I'm happy to give advice. I hold a few of those records myself, but write to me, president@ultracycling.com, and I'll give you my personal insights into how that works best, what sorts of things you might consider going after, depending on what sort of race you might have been preparing for.
And with your permission, I'll put the link to that website in the show notes, Mark.
Sure, please do.
Hey, thanks, Mark. It's been great, and we certainly wish you well. We'd like to see this organization really flourish.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.